Everybody, thank you for joining us for this event on the 2020 Poverty and Shared Prosperity Report, Reversals of Fortune. My name is Carolina Sanchez. I am the Global Director for the Poverty and Equity Global Practice. And it's a real pleasure for me to be here sharing this session and the discussion with all of you today. We are still waiting for a few people to join us, but we're going to go ahead and get started. And we hope that others will join in the next few minutes. The Poverty and Shared Prosperity Report, as many of you know, is the flagship report of the World Bank on the twin goals, reducing extreme poverty and promoting shared prosperity. It was launched for the first time in 2016, and it's produced every 2 years. It's a joint production of the Poverty and Equity Global Practice and the Development Economics Vice Presidency. And it serves as the main vehicle for the publication of the global updates on extreme poverty and shared prosperity. But the report also contains always a thematic deep dive that touches upon different issues that matter for the poverty and equity agenda. In 2016, the report focused on inequality. In 2018, we looked at alternative and complementary measures of poverty, going into the multidimensional space, but also thinking about poverty in middle income settings. And this year, of course, the focus of the report is on both the short-term and the long-term forces that are leading to the reversal in extreme poverty reduction that we are witnessing at the moment. I just want to say a word to commend the team on what was, I think, a very difficult preparation process of this report. They started with a different mandate, and then the context changed dramatically around the world as a consequence of the COVID pandemic and the associated economic crisis. And they were able to quickly refocus and repurpose in a way the report to be able to speak directly to the moment that we are living in. And I think they have very successfully done that. And I hope you will agree with me once you have a chance to hear about the main messages coming out of the report. And therefore, I hope that we'll have a very productive conversation of what this means for all of us moving forward. To kick us off in that direction, we are very privileged to have with us Marie Pangastu, who is the Managing Director for Development Policy and Partnerships at the World Bank, and who will give some opening remarks at the beginning of the event. So Marie, thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carolina. Welcome to this event. Good day to everyone. As Carolina just mentioned, we are here to discuss the key findings from the recently released Poverty and Shared Prosperity 2020 Reversal of Fortune report. This report was launched in early October and has received a lot of media attention since then. I think everybody is quoting these numbers and talking about how the COVID pandemic is leading to reversal of development gains, the rise of extreme poverty, and so on. And we thought that while the team has been briefing a number of other teams, partners, and development partners, and we've had some major public events, including the End of Poverty Day and so on, we felt that it's very important to have a bank-wide and open event. So everyone is aware of the important messages in the report and hopefully also use it in your own work. And as Carolina mentioned, this is the third report, and it's the main vehicle for us to have a biannual update of the progress of meeting the bank's twin goals. So it is obviously a key report. And this time, with the analytical piece of looking at the drivers of poverty, being the pre-existing drivers of climate change and conflict, and on top of that, as was mentioned, responding to the current situation of how COVID-19 is also adding to poverty. So I think all of us have been going around saying the 3 C's. Your name is also Carolina, led by C and A, Carolina and Hart. I think that it has been quite an important report to discuss current challenges as well as pre-existing challenges. And I think the story about how extreme poverty will rise, reversing the trend that has lifted nearly 500 million people out of extreme poverty since 2010, is very sobering. And it has been, in a way, it's a very sobering message, but it is also very good to, as a push, as a call for redoubling our efforts to address it. I just also want to join Carolina to extend my congratulations to the team and thanks to the team for their hard work in being able to be very responsive to a changing and very fluid situation. So it's a very timely report, and I also think it's a useful roadmap for all stakeholders, including policymakers. And this is what we're all about. How do we use our knowledge, our analysis to help our client countries and our stakeholders to be able to outline the policies? And besides extreme poverty, I think this report also talks about how middle income countries are affected as well, and talks about how the estimated new poor that will be in middle income countries. 82% of them will be in middle income countries as compared to 60% of the existing extreme poor. So I think this is also something that is new, sort of different, I suppose, from previous reports. And this is also telling you how we should be using this report in all the different contexts that we are in, because data is an important part of this response, and how we design our $160 billion program moving forward. And it's essential for both effective policymaking and for ensuring that governments have limited resources, so how they can optimally deploy it in the best way. And I just want to mention also that the teams are also doing efforts to do phone surveys to monitor the impacts of COVID-19 in more than 100 countries, both at the household and firm level, as I suppose a complement to the report. So I just want to close by saying that this report, I hope, all of you listening will use it as a means to start a dialogue, whether it's with client countries or your respective shareholders. Because the results of this report and the data can be used as a start of the dialogue. And I guess the message would be, the line of the message would be, yes, the picture looks very gloomy, but what does it mean? It means we must redouble our efforts to prevent a setback in development gains. And the data and the analysis will help us to understand the drivers of the increase in poverty and which groups are affected. And it would be, different, maybe with different contributions in your respective locations. And in some location, it can be all three that is affecting the poverty rise. And therefore, if you go and try to bring it down to the situation that you are facing in your area, you can then have a dialogue and have a discussion how to use the limited fiscal space more effectively to roll out social protection, health, and other programs, as well as target it better, who is really needing the help. And the ongoing household surveys will also help monitor the situation on the ground and monitor the effectiveness of the policy interventions. So I really think this is one of those great pieces of knowledge work, analysis that can immediately be used to operationalize what we need to do on the ground, whether it's through the link to the financing and also to give policy advice to our client countries, as well as to use it as a means to have a discussion with our stakeholders. So I'd like to end on that note and hope that you will all enjoy the discussion of today's report and I look forward also to the conclusions that you come up after the end of this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie, for being with us, but also I think for reminding us that this is a report that provides messages and information that can inform what we are doing, not just at the global level, but also at the country level. And I think that's something that we'll touch upon later on in the discussion. And also thank you for linking the report to some of the other efforts that are ongoing, including the high frequency monitoring surveys and drawing those connections. I think those are two very important points. We are gonna then move ahead with the presentation of the report. And we have with us the two lead authors of the report, Samuel Freire Rodriguez, who is a lead economist in the Poverty and Equity Global Practice, and Michael Woolcock, who's a lead social specialist in the research department in the Development Economics Vice Presidency. They'll share with us some of the main messages of the report, and then we'll go and engage in conversation with our panelists while we'll introduce when we get there, and then we'll open it up for a conversation with those of you that are here with us today. Because questions may actually come to your minds as Sam and Michael are going through the presentation, I invite you to use the chat box to share any questions that may come even as they are going through or as I'm talking to our panelists. Please use the all participants option when you post your questions on the chat box. I believe that that's at the bottom of the menu that you will see there. And I'll keep an eye out on the chat and we'll use those questions for the discussion that we'll have later on. And Samuel and Michael have also kindly agreed to keep an eye on it and answer some of those questions as they come, if that's feasible. So please do actively use that chat box and help us make this a very rich discussion. So with that, I'm gonna turn to Sam and Michael to share some of the emerging messages from the report. Over to you.
Thank you, Carol. Good day, everybody. We're going to make a brief presentation summarizing the main messages of the report. I'll start with the first half of the recent events and our basic diagnostics, and then my colleague Michael will continue with the main perspectives that come from the report. So we'll share now the presentation. A couple of pages back, because this is not the first page. Okay, next one. Let me start by what we believe are the main headlines of this report. These headlines, as have been said, have been in the press media for a while already, but I think it is important to underline them again. In the first part, this report is called Reversals of Fortune because we report the worst setback in poverty reduction since we started monitoring poverty in the early 1990s. This reversal involves around 100 million people entering into extreme poverty in year 2020, and poverty rates up to 9.4 or 9.1 percentage points in 2020. This is the largest reversal since the Asian crisis in 1998. That's why we say it's a 20-year, for the first time in 20 years, we see a reversal in the reduction of poverty numbers. And this reversal is larger than that one, both in absolute and relative terms. And we use this idea of the 3 C's in order to underline what we believe are the main compounding factors of this serious reversal of fortune. First and foremost, of course, is the pandemic, the COVID-19, and this impact is amplified by armed conflict and climate change. These are phenomena that are moving in different time directions and time horizons. We have evidence that armed conflict has already been playing a role in reducing poverty, decelerating the reduction of poverty, particularly in some parts of MENA in sub-Saharan Africa. But now we also have this compounding effect of climate change that is gaining ground in coming years. And we also make some estimates about the impact of climate change in future years. The main, we will say, a punchline of these headlines is that we need to have urgent action to tackle this crisis, and in what we call a twin imperative. We have to stop the pandemic and reinitiate economic growth in order to save lives and livelihoods. But we have to continue and redouble efforts in the unfinished development agenda, investments in human capital, investments in infrastructure, entrepreneurship, and a very important concern with managing risks, which the pandemic and the climate change and armed conflict are showing the importance of managing risks in poverty reduction. Next slide. The report also, as usual, next slide, please, has a series of a strong component, quantitative component, and we continue the tradition and make some innovations in terms of the quantitative component of the report. In the first place, we produce global poverty estimates on the 3 different lines that were introduced in the previous report. Now we're on a regular basis producing global poverty rates at 190, 320, and $5.5 a day, as well as multidimensional and social societal poverty lines. And we produce these global estimates up until year 2017, regional estimates up until year 2018. And we also have our estimates of shared prosperity, which involve two surveys in order to assess evolution of changes in growth for the period 2012-2017. We also have increased coverage, particularly for sub-Saharan Africa, thanks to new surveys and new efforts of collecting surveys in sub-Saharan Africa by the bank and its main counterparts in the region. But we also report a shortage of data in South Asia, and we also report up until 2014. But it's important to underline that over the years, the coverage in terms of social protection, in terms of shared prosperity indicators, and in terms of poverty has been increasing, but we have to redouble efforts as well in terms of data collection. We have our nowcasts for year 2020 and 2021 based on our estimates of our colleagues in the macro department on growth rates. And we produce projections of poverty rates up until 2030, which is the global goal of eradicating poverty by 2030. For the first time, we also include in these projections changes in inequality. So we can have a much more complex view of how poverty rates can evolve in coming years, taking into consideration not only different growth rates, but also different changes in inequality, particularly because of the renewed concern that the pandemic and the climate change and in conflicts have differential impacts on different groups. And therefore, it's important to also take into consideration inequality in our growth projections and our poverty projections. For the first time as well, we include subnational poverty maps and overlay these with subnational poverty maps of certain type of climate change risks, particularly catastrophic floods and armed conflict, some measures of armed conflict. And this allows us to have a much more complex and more nuanced picture of where poverty is and the location of poverty associated as well to these very location-specific phenomena of conflict and climate change. Next. These innovations and all these data combines with the history of the report and our monitoring for more than 2 decades already. And the previous reports already indicated some deceleration in poverty reduction. For the first 2 decades, poverty reduction had a pace of approximately 1 percentage point of global poverty reduction per year. But since the middle of the decade, that rate decelerated to 0.5% per year. So that made that even the previous report in 2018 put the achievement of the goal of poverty eradication by 2030 in jeopardy. We also report positive shared prosperity in the period 2012-2017. That means that the bottom 40% of the population was enjoying economic growth, and the economic growth was somehow pervasive and helping the poor escape their condition. But we also report that in some regions, the shared prosperity rates were lower than in the previous cohort of data, which was for 2010-2015, showing therefore, even in the previous report, some deceleration in these trends of shared prosperity. Next slide, please. So the nowcasts based on the June global economic perspectives of the World Bank macro team show this very serious reversal with poverty rates reaching 9.1 or 9.4 in 2020 and even remaining at 9.4 percentage points in 2021. These are based on growth forecasts for those 2 years, 2020 and 21, of -5% at the global level of GDP and -8% produced, and as I want to underline, in June this year. This forecast will be updated in coming months, and therefore we can have a different picture in coming weeks and months, but it's already a very serious reversal. Even assuming a neutral, no changes in the distribution, which is already a reduction of what we call the share prosperity premium compared to what was happening in previous years, this serious deceleration of growth will also involve a very serious decline in share prosperity. We estimate that 71 of the 94 countries for which we have data in two periods of time will experience lower share prosperity and lower share prosperity premium. So we are expecting increases in poverty and increases in inequality in the coming years. Next, please. We also include, as I said at the beginning, for the first time in this type of report, subnational poverty rates with overlays of subnational data on armed conflict and the aftermath of armed conflict and climate change, one of the impacts of climate change, particularly catastrophic floods. And we notice that the population in poverty are particularly concentrated in areas of high armed conflict. In our previous report on conflict-affected countries, we already noticed that only 10% of the population lives, of the global population lives in conflict-affected countries, but 40% of the people in extreme poverty are living in conflict-affected countries. So we have a serious incidence, a higher than proportionate incidence of extreme poverty in conflict-affected countries. And we also want to underline through these maps that there are areas, subnational areas and cross-national areas in which high conflict coincides with high poverty. And therefore, the problems of conflict and poverty are not only within different, suffering differing intensity within countries, but also suffering differing intensity across countries. Next slide. And we also made a similar exercise with catastrophic floods, which is only one of the potential impacts of climate change in coming years. We updated recent research in the bank and from other researchers on what will be the impact of climate change in coming years. And if unaddressed, climate change could drive between 68 and 132 million people into extreme poverty over the next decade. And this is through 5 climate change channels: reduced agricultural revenues, reduced labor productivity, higher food prices, higher incidence of natural disasters, and serious problems of health. This high exposure is particularly troublesome for the poor because the poor have more vulnerability and less resilience to climate change, disasters, and consequences. We estimate in this report that approximately 1.4 billion people in the world are exposed to catastrophic floods, and nearly half of them below the poverty line, live below the poverty line of 5.50. 132 million people in poverty already are facing, are exposed to high catastrophic floods. So we also report in this poverty and share prosperity report a high overlay between extreme poverty or poverty in general and exposure to climate change shocks. Next slide, please. This all this picture and this analysis has a series of main messages. The first one is that the goal of ending extreme poverty in 2030 is beyond reach unless a very swift, significant, and sustained action is put in place. The challenge to achieve the global poverty eradication goal of 2030 is higher than is more difficult than ever. But if we put a sustained effort and put all the advances of science and international coordination efforts, we can perhaps still continue to achieve that goal. We also want to underline that there is the combination of COVID-19, of a very serious pandemic, but also the evolving problems of armed conflict, which we also show in the report that has consequences that go beyond the existence of a conflict. Countries that suffer an armed conflict have lower standards of living for years, even after achieving peace. And climate change, which is a long-term evolving problem. All these 3 phenomena taken together are reversing the poverty trends and are also creating, because of the sudden pandemic, altering the profile of the poor. And we'll speak a little bit more about the new profile of the new poor. And all these combinations also create these hotspots in which we have a combination of very serious risks in terms of climate and in terms of conflict, but also the standard problems of chronic poverty and extreme poverty that need to be addressed. So the main messages are: we need to redouble efforts, as it was said at the beginning, in ways that allow for people to regain their livelihoods and protect their lives, but also reaching to the new poor that have different characteristics to the chronic poor, and continue and redoubling efforts of our development agenda. But we also need to take into consideration, because of these new perspectives and this new information, that we have to focus on certain areas and on certain types of countries and on certain areas within countries, because these overlaying conditions of poverty, climate change shocks, and armed conflict phenomena. So I'll pass the word now to my colleague Michael Walker. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sam, and good morning to everyone, wherever you are checking in with us this morning. So as Sam indicated at the beginning, his presentation is sort of how we got to where we are. I'm going to be just looking a bit forward-looking now in terms of what would need to change in order for the world to at least get back on track a little bit with regards to its original vision of eliminating extreme poverty by 2030, and also just consider some of the options that we have to make it more likely that that will happen. As Sam indicated, one of the unfortunate messages of this report is that the goal of ending extreme poverty by 2030 is now highly unlikely. But for that to change, as you can see on the graph on the right, levels of growth would have to be at historically unprecedented rates for that to happen. So, in the order of 8.5 or higher for that trajectory to get back to where it would need to be in order for the goal of 2030 to be attained. But even without these big dramatic changes that we've experienced in the last year, the curve was still likely to flatten over that particular period if nothing else was done. So either way, there just really does need to be both a rapid increase in economic growth, but also a sustained attention to not allowing inequality to rise. And you can see again on that graph that there are various different implications for the likelihood of that happening, depending on the level of inequality that takes hold as that growth process unfolds. It's just going to be much harder if obviously if inequality rises, and much of what we've seen so far from the pandemic does indicate that the upper classes seem to be able to respond relatively well. They can do nice things like meet on WebEx to have meetings and do their jobs. Most poor people can't do anything like that and don't have access to the kinds of technologies that would enable them to continue to earn a livelihood. So the inequality effects are going to be very consequential in terms of whether they can combine with a return to higher rates of economic growth to get the trajectory of reducing extreme poverty back on track. Next slide, please. What we've also done with the most recent rounds of surveys, what whole teams of people across the World Bank have been doing, is trying to identify more precisely some of the demographic and geographic characteristics of what we call the new poor, those that have been put back into extreme poverty as a result of COVID and as a result of the associated economic crisis that's gone with that. The blue line in the spider diagram there is the characteristics of the chronic poor, those that have traditionally, historically have been poor. And those characteristics tend to be that they're predominantly rural, have very little education, work in agriculture, work on their own small plot of land or in a small business of some kind, and employ other family members. But at least to this point, what we seem to be seeing with the emergence of those most affected or immediately affected by COVID is that they have very different kinds of characteristics. They tend to be more urban-based. They have some forms of education. They are working in services and in factory kind of employment situations. They're on salaries, or at least not self-employed, less likely to be self-employed, and are earning a more stable kind of income that would otherwise now be denied them if that business was shut down. So these are very different kinds of characteristics which have important policy implications, because that means we can't just double down on what might have been regarded as a more orthodox pro-poor development strategy. If the characteristics of those that have now find themselves in poverty are different, then we need to have a correspondingly different strategy for responding to it. It doesn't, in the grand scheme of things, the overall characteristics of that blue line remain the same. It's just that if we're trying to help those that have been most affected and most immediately affected by COVID, it does suggest that they have very different kinds of characteristics. These characteristics are also more likely to be emerging in middle-income countries, as Murray indicated at the beginning. So we have situations where not just the poor people in the poorest countries are being affected by this, but those that had thought they might have recently escaped extreme poverty now find themselves falling back, and in ways that don't naturally lend themselves to the traditional way in which one might go about implementing a more orthodox development strategy. Next slide, please. As Sam also indicated before, once you overlay all of these different effects that are causing extreme poverty to rise right now, there are certain places in the world where all of these come together, and we call them hotspots, places where you have high levels of poverty, high vulnerability to climate change, and extreme violence. And the dark blue areas across sub-Saharan Africa just show you how prevalent these places are. And you can also see, I think, and I'll come back to this later, that these are broad categories of space that aren't just restricted to a singular countries. They affect whole regions, whole geographic areas. And that has big policy implications as well, which we'll come back to later. One of the other consequences of conflicts that we report on in this report is that the effects of conflict don't just end when the conflict itself ends. Excuse me. It can continue on for upwards of a decade afterwards, or even longer in some cases if the wars have been truly catastrophic. So as important as it is to address war and end conflict in the short run, one of the consequences for poverty reduction is recognizing that the effects of violent conflict linger long thereafter in what we call a conflict debt. So the graph on the right shows you Nepal, for example, which is not currently in conflict, but has still suffering the effects of conflict even decades after it formally ended. So all of these factors combine to make it really, really difficult in the coming decades to respond to extreme poverty, because it's not just an economic phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that's created and compounded by all these other events that are occurring, and they are following very different kinds of time trajectories, as Sam indicated earlier. The really big effects of climate change actually won't be made fully visible to the world until well after 2030, but their effects are accumulating now and starting to become manifest. But the really big challenge the world faces is that it has to act now to prevent awful things happening in 2035 and 2040. And we've seen, obviously, even with the pandemic response now, that it's just really hard to get people to do actions now, even when the consequences might be only experienced weeks down the track. So once it's years down the track, the politics and the behavioral implications of trying to get people to alter their actions is just really, really hard. And that those are the big challenges the world faces as it goes forward. Next slide, please. So what do we do about all of that? Well, what's the imperative? Well, there are twin imperatives, as we indicated before. The challenges we face are without precedent. The nature of the global recession currently in place is the worst in several decades, worse since the Great Depression. So whichever way you look at it, the challenges are just enormous that we face. In the short run, the challenge is to protect lives and livelihoods, and so a very big emphasis on healthcare interventions and social protection interventions to help people avoid the worst and most immediate effects of these crises. But of course, even in the absence of these awful events, people would still be poor, and the line, as we indicated at the beginning, was still flattening. The rate of poverty reduction was declining even before all of these other events truly started to take hold. So we have to really work simultaneously in the short run in protecting lives and livelihoods, while recognizing that just those people that might otherwise have escaped from poverty are still there, and they still need the kinds of assistance and the same kinds of international cooperation that was always needed. So we call these twin imperatives, and each country's got to figure out how it's going to manage these very difficult trade-offs between providing adequate resources in the present to deal with the very looming and actual real-time challenges that they face, versus those that are more slow-moving and where the payoff will be only apparent much further down the line. Next slide, please. Next slide. Well, when that slide comes up, it will be showing you exactly what was on there. We needed to be at least thinking about these challenges, we think, in around 4 different kinds of principles. It's not at all obvious how to deal with these things. The world has never faced challenges of this scale, this complexity, and of this consequence. And so we all, as professionals, we as citizens of the world, have to figure out how to engage with this historically unprecedented challenge. And indeed, we should see it as a generational challenge in the ways that our parents and grandparents face similar challenges in their lives. This is ours, and we have to try and address it in very new and creative but committed ways. One of those principles we suggest is retaining or putting a very strong emphasis on implementation and not just the policy aspects. Policy, of course, is crucial, and finding and identifying the right policies is even more important when time is short and when budgets are limited. But it also creates a strong imperative to implement those policies as effectively and as efficiently as possible. So especially when people are being asked to do things they would rather not do, like not go out in public, like wear masks. All of these kinds of things are asking citizens to do very difficult things. And so the credibility of the responses and the willingness of citizens to abide by instructions from health experts becomes really, really crucial. So these implementation issues more generally, I think, are super important. The next, as Sam indicated, is that even with the more prosaic sort of tasks of trying to measure poverty and inequality, we still have a long way to go to be able to fully tell that story for the world at the level of detail and sophistication that we would like. Especially on the shared prosperity measures, there's still a lot more to be found and a lot more data that we need to be able to tell that story in that the way we would want to. But precisely because much of what we're trying to deal with is a moving target, and then it's not clear what is actually best for particular people in particular places, we need to have access to really high quality real-time data to be able to help us make the adjustments along the way that will help us to identify what is in fact the best use of finite resources. As multilateral organizations, I think it's also a strong onus on us to stress the importance of prevention and preparedness. These are very boring political issues. No one gets much credit for them when they actually do their job, but much of what the world is dealing with now would have been much less contentious and much less consequential if we'd had mechanisms in place to recognize and anticipate these kinds of events, or even when they were there, that we took them seriously and invested in them and kept them going and responded to the kinds of information that they've been telling us. So it's a cliche, but an ounce of prevention beats a pound of cure. And I think as a world, we need to recognize that we've created a lot of risks just by building the kind of world we have, where the bad things of the world can travel along the same highways as the good ones. And that just means we need to have corresponding risk management mechanisms in place to be able to anticipate and respond to these things in a more timely way than we currently have. And finally, I think a crucial part of what we're trying to stress here is that these are global problems and they thus require global solutions. The importance of regional, bilateral, multilateral cooperation has never been more important. Even if an individual country is able to enact and implement an effective response strategy, the effectiveness of that strategy is going to depend crucially on how its neighbors behave and how the rest of the region and the world behaves. And with climate change and conflict and with the pandemic, none of these respect borders. They are all phenomena that play out according to their own logics, and we have to be much more attuned as a world to figuring out how to share and learn from and work with each other to respond to these as a global community. That is a really difficult challenge in these times when everybody seems to be much more focused on their own national concerns, on their own particular group's concerns. And so I think as employees of a multilateral organization and as citizens of the world, we need to be doing a much more coordinated role in being able to push the importance of working together to solve these. This was the clear message of the WDR back in 2017 on governance and the law, and I think it's become only more apparent with events that have transpired since then. So that's the report. We're happy to hand this now over to our discussants, but then also to engage with your questions following that. Thanks very much.